You know, there is this really fascinating, almost terrifying quirk of human psychology that constantly reveals itself whenever we're faced with massive, invisible threats.
Oh, absolutely. We have a massive blind spot for anything that isn't immediately punching us in the face.
Right. Exactly. So think about a towering, decades-old suspension bridge spanning a massive river, right?
Mhm.
Structural engineers do this exhaustive, microscopic inspection, and they come back waving massive red flags.
Yeah, they lay out all the data.
Exactly. They say, look, the core supports deep underwater are rotting. The metallurgical stress has reached this critical threshold. And they state unequivocally that if the foundational integrity isn't addressed, the bridge is going to collapse.
Right, but what's the default human reaction to that?
We stand on the shore and we just look at the bridge. Cars are driving over it. The sun is shining. The cables look perfectly fine from where we're standing.
Because the steel isn't literally twisting and snapping right in this exact second.
Yes. Because it's not falling down right now, we look at the engineers and dismiss them. We say, oh, they're exaggerating. We operate on this bizarre assumption that if a warning is genuine, the disaster must be unfolding concurrently with the warning.
It is the ultimate confusion between not yet and never.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, we are biological creatures, right?
Yeah.
We're wired for immediate tactile feedback. If you touch a hot stove, your nervous system registers the burn instantly and you pull your hand away.
It's a linear, immediate feedback loop.
Precisely. But complex systems, whether we are talking about architectural structures, global supply chains, or entire civilizational models, they do not operate on the timeline of a hot stove.
No, they definitely don't.
They operate on a timeline of accrual. Stress compounds over time.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the bridge hasn't collapsed by Tuesday afternoon is not proof of its safety. It is simply the time required for the mathematics of the structural failure to mature.
Which perfectly sets up the core mission of our deep dive today. We are taking a foundational text, specifically Surah Al-Ankabut, Ayat 52 through 55, and we are fundamentally shifting the lens.
And it's a much-needed shift.
Yeah, because for centuries, these verses have been wrapped in this thick layer of traditional religious sentimentality, right? They're often read as like theological folklore or some mystical prophecy about an afterlife.
Right, the usual fire and brimstone reading.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you strip away that ritualistic overlay, if you look at the raw linguistics and the structural logic of the text, a completely different framework emerges.
A completely rational one.
Yes. We are looking at this through the eyes of master sociologists and systems engineers. So this isn't a mystical poem. It is a clinical diagnostic manual dissecting the anatomy of civilizational survival, the mechanics of structural fracturing, and frankly, the mathematical certainty of systemic collapse.
And that pivot in perspective changes absolutely everything about how the text functions. I mean, when you remove the sentimentality, you are left with a highly rational socioeconomic blueprint.
It's pure systems analysis.
Exactly. It forces you to look at a society not as a collection of individuals holding, private spiritual beliefs, but as a massive interconnected organism. It outlines the specific mechanisms by which that organism builds immunity, how it introduces pathogens into its own bloodstream, and the absolute inevitability of the consequences that follow.
We're basically analyzing the operating system of a society.
We are.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are going to analyze how a system collapses, my instinct is that we can't start at the rubble, right? We have to start at the initial deviation.
Right. The collapse at the end is just the final visible symptom of a pathology that started much earlier.
Yes, and there is this vivid analogy from the source material that helps map out this initial fracture. Imagine a high-speed train hurtling down a set of tracks toward a specific unified destination.
I'm picturing it.
So at some point, the train hits a junction point and a switch is pulled. The train diverts onto the wrong track. Now, the people inside the train might not realize the track has shifted. They just want to reach their destination.
So they keep doing what they were doing.
Exactly. They start shoveling more coal into the engine. They optimize the boiler. They increase their speed. They are putting in intense, passionate, undeniable effort.
But it's totally misguided.
Right. Because the brutal irony of their situation is that because the track itself is wrong, every single ounce of that extra effort, every burst of speed, is actually carrying them faster and further away from their true destination.
That is such a crucial distinction. Motion is fundamentally distinct from direction. That train analogy perfectly captures the illusion of systemic progress.
Yeah, because they feel like they're moving forward.
Exactly. Because the passengers feel the vibration of the wheels, because they feel the heat of the engine and the acceleration, they just assume they're advancing. But if the foundational trajectory is compromised, your own intense effort becomes the primary instrument of your deviation.
Wow. Your effort becomes the instrument of your deviation.
Yeah. The sociological analysis of this text points out a hard mechanical truth regarding systems if a society realizes it is on the wrong track. It does not matter how much it tweaks the engine, paints the train cars, or improves the seating arrangements.
None of that fixes the core issue.
None of it. The only mathematical solution to a diverted trajectory is to put the train in reverse and back up all the way to the exact junction point where the divergence occurred. You must return to the root cause of the fracture.
So if we apply that train track analogy to the socio-political framework of the text, we hit a massive distinction. We are looking at two concepts that history has largely lumped together, but which this systems analysis treats as entirely opposite paradigms.
You're talking about the concept of a Deen versus a madhab.
Yes, the concept of a Deen versus a madhab. It seems like confounding these two is the exact moment the train switches tracks.
Oh, absolutely. Confounding them is the root of the civilizational fracture. In the traditional, sentimental view, the word Deen is almost universally translated simply as religion.
Right, people just use them interchangeably.
Exactly. But a rigorous sociological reading rejects that entirely.
Right.
A madhab, a religion in the traditional sense, is individual, private, and psychological.
It's like your personal relationship with the universe.
Right. It is a personal set of rituals, a private relationship with the divine. By definition, a madhab can exist in a vacuum. A person can practice it sitting completely alone in a forest.
Okay, so what is a Deen then?
A Deen is a collective socioeconomic system. It is a constitutional state. It is an organized societal structure that governs the distribution of resources, the administration of justice, economics, and law.
So if I'm tracking this correctly, a madhab is what an individual believes in their heart, but a Deen is the actual operating system of the society they inhabit.
That is the essential dividing line, yes. And the core systemic requirement for any Deen to function is singularity of authority.
Meaning there can only be one rule book.
Exactly. A unified state requires one singular final constitutional authority. You cannot run a cohesive state if you have 5 different constitutions operating simultaneously and contradicting one another.
That would just be chaos.
Complete chaos. And within the context of the text, Ayat 29.51 poses a rhetorical question. Is it not sufficient for them that we have sent down to you the book? The Quran, in this sociological framework, is not presented as a book of spiritual maxims.
Right, it's not a self-help book.
No, it is the central, immutable constitution for this societal operating system. It is the unchangeable source code that ensures the entire societal structure remains unified and robust.
But historical observation tells us that the train certainly did not stay on that singular track. The analysis delves deeply into how this unified constitutional system fractured in the post-classical eras.
Right, the introduction of secondary authorities.
Yes, centuries after the foundation of the system, societies began adopting these secondary and tertiary authorities. They began compiling thousands upon thousands of oral traditions, historical anecdotes, and incredibly dense, very juristic manuals.
And how's that usually framed by historians?
Well, the traditional narrative usually frames this era of compilation as a great theological enrichment, right? Like adding detail and flavor to the religion. But through a systems engineering lens, this wasn't an enrichment at all. It was a catastrophic constitutional crisis.
It was a disaster.
Yeah.
The moment a society introduces secondary legislative authorities alongside its primary constitution, it destroys the singularity of the system.
Mm-hmm.
That is the pulling of the switch at the train junction.
The exact moment of divergence.
Exactly. This historical phenomenon is the exact mechanism that created the myriad of sects we see today. The introduction of multiple human-made legislative authorities shattered the single Deen, the unified societal system, and replaced it with fragmented religious groups, or madhabs, that hold entirely different baselines of reality.
And they can't reconcile with each other.
No, because you end up with groups that literally refuse to stand behind one another in the same physical space because their secondary operating manuals dictate contradictory terms of existence.
Okay, let me test a modern organizational analogy here to see if the mechanics line up. Let's imagine a massive, highly successful global corporation.
Okay.
It operates on a single core operating manual that governs absolutely everything: financial ethics, supply chain logistics, employee rights. Because everyone references the same manual, the company is a cohesive juggernaut.
Makes sense. One rule book, one direction.
Right. Now imagine the regional managers decide that the core manual lacks specific local flavor. So the manager in New York writes a supplementary manual containing 500 new rules. The manager in Tokyo writes an entirely different manual based on the oral histories of the company's founders.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, and the manager in London writes yet another one based on philosophical interpretations of corporate law. Suddenly, this single corporation is attempting to operate using 4 or 5 competing manuals simultaneously.
Which is structurally impossible.
Exactly. If the Tokyo office defines a quality product fundamentally differently than the New York office, the corporation doesn't become more productive because it has more rules. It inevitably mathematically splinters.
The corporation splinters because communication breaks down at the structural level. The baseline definitions of reality no longer match. When a society adopts multiple competing authorities, it ceases to be a single entity.
It's just a bunch of factions wearing the same uniform.
That's a great way to put it. It devolves into a collection of warring factions that might share the same historical brand name, but they're operating on entirely different source codes. The text treats this fracturing not as a minor administrative hiccup, but as the ultimate systemic betrayal.
Wow.
In this framework, replacing the singular constitutional law with human-made supplementary manuals is the structural equivalent of idolatry.
That structural fracturing brings to mind a profoundly sharp, almost darkly comedic observation from the sources regarding the story of Noah's flood.
Oh, the clay pots analogy.
Yes. The analysis uses this ancient narrative to highlight the sheer absurdity of sectarian splintering. The fundamental premise of the flood narrative is that a massive, civilization-ending environmental shock is imminent.
A total systemic stress test.
Right. And survival in that scenario requires structural integrity. It requires being inside a single, unified, engineered vessel capable of withstanding the external pressure. You need the ark.
You need the singular Deen.
Exactly. But instead of collaborating to maintain that single, structurally sound arc, the fragmented groups decide they are better off relying on their own individual interpretations of survival. So they all go out and build their own little individual clay pots.
Which is just so incredibly arrogant.
It is. They sit in these fragile pots, floating on the rising water, and because they haven't sunk in the first 5 minutes, they assume their methodology is flawless.
Their assumption of safety completely ignores the physics of the impending storm. The storm doesn't just raise the water level, it introduces massive kinetic turbulence.
And those clay pots are not built for turbulence.
Not at all. And when that turbulence hits, the storm doesn't even need to directly drown them. The turbulence simply takes their fragile little clay pots and smashes them against one another.
So they destroy each other.
Exactly. Their own proximity to one another, combined with their competing fragility, becomes the instrument of their destruction. They lacked a unified structure to weather the systemic shock, having completely replaced structural integrity with tribal stubbornness.
So we have a society where the train has switched tracks. The singular constitution has been abandoned for 1,000 competing manuals. The populace is floating in fragile clay pots, structurally rotting from the inside out.
A recipe for total collapse.
Yeah. By all laws of systems engineering, the society should collapse. But the collapse does not happen overnight. And this temporal gap, this delay, is where human psychology plays its most dangerous trick.
Yes, the arrogance of the immediate present.
Right. When the society doesn't implode by next Tuesday, a specific kind of cognitive arrogance takes root. The skeptics start mistaking the delay for a disproof of the warning.
When a society's core operating system fractures, the warning of inevitable collapse is mathematically sound. But because the skyscrapers don't crumble the very next day, the populace begins to mock the diagnosis.
And this dynamic is highlighted perfectly in Ayat 29.53, right? The text quotes the taunt of the skeptics who are being warned about the systemic rot. The skeptics say, they ask you to hasten the punishment.
Yes, the specific Arabic term used in the text is yastajilanaka bilad hab.
Okay, if we do a linguistic deep dive on that term, yastajilanaka, it reveals so much more than just a polite inquiry. It's a very specific kind of demand. If we break down the root, what exactly is the psychological posture of someone saying this?
Well, the term yastajilanaka implies an active demand to rush, to artificially accelerate a process, to bring something forward before its due time. They're seeking to force the consequence to manifest immediately.
Like they want it on demand.
Exactly. They view the warning of civilizational collapse through the lens of modern consumerism. It is akin to pushing a button on an app and demanding the package arrive at your door 10 seconds later.
Right, their logic dictates, you claim the societal system is broken. Well, I am looking out my window, the markets are open, the buildings are standing, and I still have electricity. Therefore, your warning is false.
If you want me to believe the structural integrity is compromised, make the buildings fall down right now on my command.
Which introduces what we can call the engine of reason framework. Demanding instant ruin as the sole proof of a structural flaw is a fundamental failure of logic. It's just a massive category error.
It truly is.
If we use a financial analogy, it's like looking at the concept of compound interest, but in reverse compound debt. Let's imagine a scenario where a person is maxing out multiple high-interest credit cards every single month just to pay the minimum balance on their mortgage.
A completely unsustainable financial model.
Exactly. A forensic accountant looks at the ledger and says, if you maintain this behavior, you will absolutely go bankrupt. Your financial system is structurally doomed.
The math is undeniable.
Right. But if that person turns to the accountant, swipes their credit card to buy a coffee, sees the transaction approved, and says, see, I just bought a coffee, I am not bankrupt this exact second, hasten my bankruptcy, make my bank account hit absolute zero right now to prove your math is real. I mean, we would call that person delusional.
The delusion lies in disconnecting cause from effect simply because there is a temporal delay between them. The fact that the individual doesn't physically see the numbers in their bank account evaporating second by second, the fact that they are not evicted from their home that same afternoon, does not render the mathematical law of compounding debt a superstitious myth.
The debt is accruing silently in the background.
Exactly. The structural flaw, the deficit between income and expenditure, exists as a hard reality, regardless of the individual's inability to perceive the immediate pain of it.
So the skeptics demanding the punishment be hastened are essentially denying the existence of compound debt because they can't see the ledger updating in real time.
Yes, they are looking at the silent accrual period and mislabeling it as absolute safety. The text is performing a profound reframing of time itself in response to this taunt. It establishes that consequence does not operate on the impatient demander's timeline. It operates exclusively on the system's timeline.
Right, the system dictates the pace.
The demand to witness the punishment now is the ultimate symptom of an intellect that refuses to read the trajectory of its own actions. A delayed consequence is not an absent one. The silence of the accrual period is merely the system gathering the necessary variables to finalize the equation.
If a delayed consequence is never an absent one, it really begs the next logical progression in our analysis. If the collapse isn't instantaneous, if the society isn't struck by lightning the very moment it fractures its unified constitution, how exactly does the systemic timeline function?
What is the actual mechanism governing the delay?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the mechanism is detailed in the continuation of that exact same verse, Ayat 29.53. The text states, were it not for an appointed term, the punishment would have come to them. It will come upon them suddenly while they do not perceive.
And the pivotal phrase there is the appointed term.
Exactly. Ajalun Musama.
Now, if we unpack Ajalun Musama, we have to be really careful not to slip back into traditional theology. The traditional ear hears a appointed term and imagines, a divine calendar in the sky, a mystical date circled in red ink by a deity.
Right, like an arbitrary deadline.
Exactly. But this systems engineering approach strips that away completely.
It replaces the mystical calendar with the concept of mukafat-e-amal, the law of requital. This is requital understood as brutal mathematical accrual.
Mathematical accrual.
Yes, it is the universal law of cause and effect applied to human actions on a macro-societal scale. Think about it in chemistry. A reaction requires a specific amount of time to reach a boiling point or a state of crystallization.
It doesn't happen instantly.
No. In sociology, every structural decision, every legislative act, every instance of corruption or exploitation generates a corresponding consequence. But these outcomes do not mature instantly. They mature on a set schedule governed by a specific time constant.
So, if a society introduces a destructive element, say, an economic policy that heavily exploits the working class, the consequence of that policy has a literal time constant before it manifests as civil unrest or economic collapse.
Exactly. The Ajalun Musama, the appointed term, is precisely that maturity date. The text is stating that the only thing standing between a destructive society and its inevitable collapse is this scheduled maturity date.
It's just waiting for the timer to run out.
It is simply the duration required for the systemic rot to eat through the foundational pillars. The consequence is not being held back by divine mercy, and certainly not because the law of cause and effect has been suspended. It is held back only because the systemic process of decay takes a quantifiable amount of time to finalize.
I want to clarify a boundary around this concept because it's so easy for people to conflate societal destruction with random natural disasters. When people hear about an appointed term of sudden punishment, their minds often jump to, like, a tsunami wiping out a coastline or an earthquake leveling a city.
Right, acts of nature.
Yeah. So if a society adopts fragmented sectarian legal manuals, is the implication here that the law of requital generates a tornado to destroy them?
No. The analysis is incredibly emphatic about separating external natural phenomena from internal systemic requital. A tectonic plate shifting and causing an earthquake is an event in the natural physical world. It is an environmental hazard.
It's not a moral judgment on the society.
Exactly. What the law of requital governs, what this text is diagnosing, is an internal, terminal medical diagnosis of the societal body.
A terminal diagnosis that naturally leads to the visceral medical analogy the sources use to differentiate between a sudden accident and a sudden consequence.
Yes, consider the biological formation of a kidney stone.
Ouch, yeah.
A kidney stone does not materialize out of the ether in 5 seconds. It forms silently, accruing calcium and minerals, layer by microscopic layer, over a period of perhaps 6 months to a year.
It's a slow build.
Very slow. During that entire accrual period, the lead time, the patient feels perfectly healthy. They go to work, they exercise, they eat whatever they want. They might even explicitly mock their doctor's warnings about their diet and hydration.
I feel fine, Doc. What do you know?
Exactly. Their logic is, you told me drinking this much soda would ruin my health, but I feel fantastic. That is the exact arrogance of the societal skeptic demanding instant punishment.
They are effectively standing in the doctor's office shouting, "Hasten my kidney failure."
And the pathology obliges, not by rushing, but by developing exactly according to biological laws. And then, one random Tuesday, the stone shifts. It drops into a duct and blocks the flow. The ajalun musama, the appointed term, has arrived.
And the pain hits?
The agony that hits the patient is sudden, overwhelming, and total. Now, was that immense pain an accident? No. Was it an arbitrary punishment handed down from the sky? Absolutely not. The delay was simply the time required for the biological pathology to mature.
It was inevitable.
When the text notes that the consequence will come suddenly while they do not perceive, it is describing the exact moment the stone shifts. The process of accrual was long, silent, and gradual. But the manifestation of the systemic failure is abrupt and catastrophic.
Framing societal decline as a metabolic failure rather than a lightning bolt shifts the entire paradigm of how we view history. It means that decline is quantifiable, and the analysis introduces a sociological balance scale to help visualize this, because a civilization isn't just doing one single thing at a time, right?
It is a massive organism with millions of simultaneous inputs and outputs.
Exactly. So society operates on an aggregate scale of constructive actions versus destructive actions. On any given day, a society is performing constructive acts, building infrastructure, educating the next generation, advancing scientific research, maintaining equitable courts.
The things that build resilience.
Right. But simultaneously, it is generating destructive acts, corruption, fraud, sectarian violence, exploitation of resources. The law of requital operates on the net aggregate of these forces.
It's running tally.
Yes. As long as the constructive developmental forces outweigh the destructive friction, the society remains structurally robust. It can absorb the damage. The scale leans heavily in favor of vitality.
But the mathematics dictate that if the destructive inputs continue to rise, eventually that scale must tip.
It has to tip.
The very moment the destructive acts outweigh the constructive acts, the decline initiates. And it must be stressed again, this decline is not a punitive measure from an angry deity. It is the natural, unavoidable mathematical output of the society's own cumulative input.
You get out what you put in.
If you inject more toxins into a biological body than the liver and kidneys can process, the organs fail. If you inject more corruption, structural perjury, and sectarian friction into a societal body than its constructive institutions can mitigate, the society fails. It's a cold, clinical equation.
If the equation is that clinical and the society is fundamentally rotting from within, if the scale has tipped and the metaphorical kidney stone is silently growing, it raises a massive psychological question.
Why doesn't anyone notice?
Exactly. How can an entire civilization be standing on a rotting suspension bridge, feeling the sway of the cables, and honestly believe they are in perfect health? Why doesn't the societal intellect self-correct before the maturity date releases the final consequence?
The answer lies in one of the most insidious aspects of systemic failure, the psychology of self-deception. The text provides a razor-sharp psychological diagnostic of a society in this state. It essentially comes down to the massive, unbridgeable chasm between what a society verbally claims to be doing and what it is structurally actually doing.
The populace verbally claims to be following the singular system, the Deen, the unified constitution, while structurally they are acting entirely against it, fragmenting into those sectarian clay pots we talked about earlier.
The analysis references Ayat 2.89 to map out this cognitive dissonance. The text describes a demographic that confidently, loudly proclaims, "We believe in the system," while suffering from a profound subconscious delusion.
They're lying to themselves.
Completely. They're operating entirely on sentimental tradition and rote repetition, completely devoid of rational, critical thought. They broadcast their adherence to this system through aesthetics.
Right, the aesthetics of unity.
Yes, they broadcast the call to prayer over massive loudspeakers. They memorize and chant the right slogans. They perform the physical mechanics of the rituals with absolute precision.
But if the structural foundation is fractured, the precision of the ritual is meaningless.
The text highlights that uttering words of allegiance is effectively a zero-value action if the societal structure does not practically, materially implement the ultimate authority of that constitution.
It doesn't matter how loud you shout it.
Exactly. A society can chant the words of the Constitution 24 hours a day, but if its courts operate on bribery, if its economic model relies on the ruthless exploitation of the vulnerable, if its populace is violently divided into sects that harbor generational hatred for one another, the chanting is not just irrelevant, it is an active mechanism of self-deception.
I want to dig into the legal analogy the analysis uses to illustrate this because it perfectly captures the absurdity of the situation. They compare this societal behavior to the legal concept of perjury.
Structural perjury.
Yes. Imagine a witness called to the stand in a court of law. They place their hand on a holy book, they swear an oath to tell the absolute truth, and then they sit down and loudly, confidently testify that they witnessed a purple dragon steal a car.
A complete fabrication.
They are testifying with utter conviction to a reality that fundamentally does not exist. In a legal framework, that is perjury. It is a crime against objective truth. Now, map that onto a civilization.
The scale of that lie is staggering.
Right. A society stands up on the world stage and claims to be unified. It claims to be operating under the singular constitutional system of peace and equity. Yet, simultaneously, it is living in absolute sectarian chaos, massive economic disparity, and structural rot. That society isn't just struggling, it is actively committing structural perjury.
They are living a macroscopic lie.
Yes. And they have repeated the aesthetics of this lie so frequently and with such loudspeakers that they have actually deceived their own intellects into believing it is true.
That self-deception is the exact blindfold that prevents them from seeing the impending collapse. They have tragically mistaken the outward performance of the system for the actual mechanical reality of the system.
They think the noise is progress.
They assume that because they are going through the physical motions, the engine must be generating forward thrust. But the gears inside the gearbox are completely stripped. They lack the necessary societal vision, the critical scientific thought, to look past their own comforting slogans and measure the actual mathematical output of their actions.
They refuse to look at the ledger.
They are blind to the accrual of their own destruction because of that refusal.
Which inevitably brings us to the climax of this structural timeline, because a society can only commit structural perjury for so long. Eventually, the delusion shatters against the hard rock of reality. Eventually, the Ajalun Musamma, the appointed term, is reached.
The bill comes due.
The kidney stone shifts. The suspension bridge snaps. This leads to what is arguably the most chilling and, based on this analytical framework, the most deeply misunderstood imagery in the entire text. What actually happens when the maturity date arrives?
The closing imagery of the text, found in Ayat 29.5455, is where the traditional translations often veer heavily into the mythological.
Yeah, they lose the thread entirely.
A standard translation usually reads something to the effect of, "Hell encompasses the deniers, the day the punishment covers them from above and below."
And the moment a traditional mind hears hell and punishment from above and below, it instantly projects that into the afterlife. It envisions a literal pit of physical fire, demons with pitchforks, a torture chamber waiting for people after they die.
It's pure folklore.
But if we maintain our discipline and stick strictly to the systems engineering linguistic analysis, we have to strip away all of that post-classical theological folklore.
We must analyze the specific terminology, use the words Jahannam or Jahim In a clinical sociological context, these terms do not describe a supernatural afterlife waiting room.
What do they actually mean?
The etymological root of these words denotes a state of halted progress, a searing, inescapable condition of systemic failure. The text is making a profound declaration. It states that this destruction, this Jahannam, is already enclosing them.
Wait, already?
Yes.
Ah.
It is not a future destination they are traveling toward. It is an accruing present reality beneath their feet at the exact moment they are arrogantly demanding to see the punishment.
If I am understanding the timeline here, when the skeptics taunt the warning and say, hasten the punishment, the text is essentially replying, you are demanding to see the fire, completely unaware that you are already standing inside the furnace.
Exactly. That is the concept of Burzat, which
Okay.
translates to actualization or manifestation. It describes a phenomenon that exists as a potential, silent, accruing force, suddenly crossing a threshold and becoming terrifyingly manifest and visible.
The heat was always there.
The destruction, the systemic rot, the Jahannam, did not arrive from the sky on the appointed term. It was always there. It was there while they were shoveling coal on the diverted train track. It was there while they were fracturing into isolated clay pots. It was there while they were committing structural perjury.
They just didn't see it.
They simply lacked the sociological vision to perceive it. The sudden punishment is not a new external event being inflicted upon them. It is merely the exact moment the invisible internal rot becomes a visible, inescapable collapse.
There is an anecdote in the analysis that illustrates this disconnect with brutal clarity. It's the story of the fiery preacher. Imagine a religious preacher standing at a pulpit delivering a sermon to an audience of skeptics.
Oh, I know this one. It's so potent.
He is giving a lengthy, impassioned, highly theatrical sermon about the terrors of the afterlife. He is painting incredibly elaborate pictures of future hellfire, describing giant scorpions and venomous snakes that will torture the sinners for eternity. He is expending all this energy trying to scare the populace into behavioral compliance through the threat of future agony.
The bitter irony of that scene is devastating when viewed through a sociological lens.
It is utterly devastating because a skeptic in the audience could stand up and point out the absolute absurdity of the preacher's position. The preacher is utilizing all his intellectual energy to paint a picture of a mythical future hell,
while ignoring his current reality.
Yes, he is completely tragically blind to the fact that his current socioeconomic reality is a living nightmare. His people are politically enslaved, they are culturally degraded, they have zero influence on the world stage, they are economically exploited by ruling elites, and their societal structure is entirely broken.
That reality is the hell.
That reality, their present existence, is the actual hell. He is already living in the fire. He is already being bitten by the scorpions of systemic subjugation and poverty. But his mind is so deeply conditioned to focus on the folklore of tomorrow that he cannot perceive the absolute ruin of today.
He's distracted by ghosts while his house burns down.
Exactly. He is completely consumed by the very systemic failure he thinks he is warning people about in the future.
That anecdote is the perfect mapping of individual self-deception onto civilizational collapse. When a society completely loses its grip on objective reality, it substitutes mythological fears for structural analysis. It obsesses over the metaphorical snakes of the afterlife, while actively ignoring the metallurgical rust eating away at the bridge's foundation in the present.
And the text drives the totality of this failure home with its final encompassing image. It states that when the appointed term is reached, this systemic consequence will cover them from above and below. If we translate from above and below out of literalist mythological terms, meaning we aren't talking about meteors falling from the sky and lava erupting from the ground. What is the exact sociological breakdown of this multi-tiered destruction?
It describes a complete, unrecoverable systemic implosion. In this sociological framework, above represents the upper echelons of society.
The power structures.
Yes, the leadership, the ruling elites, the political structures, the wealthy, the lawmakers. Below represents the masses, the general populace, the working class, the foundational demographics.
So everyone is involved.
Everyone. When a society exhausts its constructive capital and hits its appointed term of collapse, the systemic friction destroys every tier simultaneously. The elites above become utterly corrupt, losing all sense of civic duty. They turn oppressive and predatory, hoarding resources and raining down exploitation, heavy taxation, and tyranny upon the populace.
And what happens below?
Simultaneously, the masses below, crushed by the immense weight of this elite predation and deeply blinded by their own internal sectarian hatreds, erupt in rebellion, chaos, and civil war.
It's a localized failure scaling up into a total structural cascading failure. The roof of the building caves in at the exact same moment the foundation gives out.
It is a state of absolute friction where neither the leaders nor the led survive. The elites are eventually destroyed by the chaotic uprising and total unmanageability of the masses, and the masses are destroyed by the violent oppression and resource deprivation enforced by the elite.
They just crush each other.
They're crushed between two immense forces entirely of their own making. This is the ultimate terrifying manifestation of the law of requital. The structural perjury they lived for decades or centuries has finally reached its mathematical maturity date, and the inevitable result is a societal organism that consumes itself entirely.
We have covered an immense expanse of conceptual ground here, moving from the microscopic initial fracture at the train junction, all the way to the multi-tiered, violent implosion of an entire civilization. If we take a step back and look at the entire blueprint, how do we synthesize these mechanics?
The synthesis reveals a profound dynamic between what is permanent and what is merely variable. Throughout human history, the specific variables constantly change.
The details look different.
Right. The names of the great empires change. The specific titles of the competing secondary manuals change. The aesthetic designs of the clay pots vary from century to century. The specific historical triggers that initiate their final collapses, a famine, a war, an economic depression, those change too.
The actors change, the costumes change, but the script remains identical.
The underlying systems engineering the permanent principle outlined in the text never changes. The time-constant logic of the law of requital is immutable. You absolutely cannot rush a systemic consequence.
You can't press the fast-forward button.
No. You cannot demand that a structural flaw prove its existence by causing an immediate collapse. And most crucially, the delay of the consequence is never, under any circumstances, a disproof of its reality. The debt accrues silently on an appointed schedule, gathering kinetic force in the background, and it lands with absolute precision exactly when the equation finalizes.
Which brings the reality of this analysis directly into the lap of the individual listening right now. Because the purpose of analyzing this text through such a clinical, unforgiving lens isn't just historical curiosity.
Not at all.
It is to equip you with the analytical tools necessary to see past the illusion of the immediate present. The mechanics of the law of requital do not just apply to ancient empires, they scale perfectly to every level of human organization.
We are all actively participating in complex structures every single day. Whether those structures are macro level, like national fiat economies, global supply chains, and environmental policies, or micro level.
Like your own life.
Exactly. Like the organizational culture of your workplace, or the compounding habits of your own personal health and finances, the mechanics apply universally. The temporal gap between an action and its consequence is not an exemption from the law, it is merely the schedule of the law.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. It is a slightly chilling metric, but an incredibly empowering one if applied correctly. Look very closely at the systems operating in your own life right now.
Audit your own systems.
Yes. Examine the economic models you rely on, the political structures you endorse, the daily habits you assume are harmless. Where in your life are you currently mistaking the silence of a growing pathology for the proof of robust health?
That's the real question.
Where are you confusing the comfortable temporary silence of not yet with the absolute mathematically impossible safety of never? Because as this blueprint makes devastatingly clear, just because the suspension bridge hasn't fallen into the river today doesn't mean the rust isn't already calculating the exact hour of its collapse.
The ultimate test of human intellect is recognizing the accrual of the rot long before it manifests as the ruin.
Thanks for diving into the mechanics of these systems with us. Keep questioning the structures around you, demand to see the root cause, and never let the calm of the present moment blind you to the trajectory of the system.